everybody. Welcome to Langley Adams Library in Groveland, Massachusetts. We have a special guest this evening, author Paul Hertneky, and he has just written, well, didn't just write it, it was just released, Rust Belt Boy. So it's fresh off the press, and we are so excited and thrilled to have you here. And I'm going to turn it over to you. Let's have a nice round of applause for Paul.
Thank you, Sue. Thank you all for coming tonight. So this is a book that I've been working on for about 10 years. It's I will read the first chapter to you so that you kind of get a sense of what my motivation was. It's called The Turning Tide. Most of the essays and stories I've written about growing up in Ambridge, Pennsylvania, the details of life in a steel town with its ethnic enclaves and round-the-clock factories, I relegated to a file while the surrounding industrial heartland crumbled. Returning to this once illustrious plateau and its steep hillside neighborhoods 15 miles upriver from Pittsburgh broke my heart as the nation averted its eyes from the economic disaster sweeping across the Great Lakes in the 1980s and 90s, taking Ambridge with it. Unemployed workers poured into Sunbelt cities, and the places they abandoned were so widespread their stories became a cliche. I kept my drafts in a drawer. If I were going to look at them again, the tide would have to turn. One day in 2005, my father pointed out an item in the Beaver County Times about an Australian developer and his interests in the town's brownfields, polluted post-industrial tracts the Environmental Protection Agency identified as available for sale and federal matching funds for the cost of cleaning them up. But who was this Aussie? I had to meet him. I had an intense interest in anyone who had a vision for my decrepit hometown, some of which was fueled by the natural skepticism natives had already voiced about his great plan. I worked a few contacts and set up a lunch with Robert Multoney and his local man on the scene, Michael Bort. During our meal in a converted silk-making operation from the 1830s in the historic district, Multoney, a trim, brawny, former brick peeler from Perth, with a nose that travels east to west, ordered steamed milk with honey. The young barista blanched upon hearing the order, but figured it out quickly enough. I, on the other hand, was speechless. Metaphors seldom hurl themselves at me like that. Here was a man looking to cash in on 425 acres right in the middle of town that had been built by thousands of immigrants who had been seeking a land of milk and honey. As I set foot outside afterwards, I looked left and thought about the wave of eventual steelworkers who came in 1904. I looked right, straight into the German enclave, built in 1824, and I looked around at this plateau along the Ohio River that George Washington had surveyed for speculation in 1753. Noting the excellence of the land and negotiating with the chief of 7 Indian tribes who built a commercial center right over here at the end of the 1600s and prospered for more than 50 years. For 3 centuries at least, humans had been coming to this place to make their lives, and in each century they were led there by a single man, visionaries all. Might Robert Multoney be the 4th? A land flowing with milk and honey is how it goes in Exodus. In my reading, God had promised the Israelites he would send them to this most glorious of all lands. And they'd better get to it and stay in line or he'd kill them all, but never mind about that. As children, we heard very little about the events that had taken place in Ambridge. Our teachers ignored the stories. Our immigrant parents and grandparents showed little interest in local history. It was not their history. They were taught to look ahead, not back, conquer nature, explore the frontier, exploit the resources, manifest destiny. If anything truly important happened here, it would have been included in the textbooks that came from Boston. In many ways, Ambridge served as a border town between the Northeast and the Midwest, and always displayed a wild frontier attitude. Men gambled away their wives. Children operated bars. Fortune seekers stopped for the night before heading into the vast Midlands. Sewickley, its affluent neighbor to the east, turns up its tweedy collars against the winds off the plains and reverently faces New England. Just to the west, beyond Ambridge, life flattens and spreads out. Prosperity allowed my grandparents and parents to remain in town with every expectation that succeeding generations would do the same. But my generation's economic prospects fell away at the same time that all Americans became more mobile. And ours was a restless generation to begin with. Between 1975 and 1995, half of the baby boomers left hometowns in a swath of geography that runs roughly from Troy, New York, south to Baltimore, west to St. Louis, and north to Duluth. When heavy industry began to collapse in the late 1970s, boomers were between 15 and 35 years old, either in the workforce or about to be. The steel industry alone lost nearly 300,000 jobs in the blink of an eye, setting off a widespread exodus, one that equaled the largest internal migration in the U.S. history. Ironically, roughly 6 million African Americans fled into the North when the Industrial Revolution began, and the same number of industrial workers moved out when the era ended 100 years later. But the Great Migration North took 50 years to unfold, whereas the emptying of the Rust Belt took place in only 20 years. Crash and all, most of my family still lives around Pittsburgh and has watched it rise from the ashes. One upside of relying on a single industry meant that the speed with which it fell affected the speed of its recovery. Pittsburgh hit bottom hard and has bounced back more quickly than similar cities. In the 1990s, the county surrounding Pittsburgh had the second oldest population in the United States, just behind Palm Beach, and its schools, social welfare, and health systems were forced to innovate. They have, breaking new ground in urban education and devising community medical systems that keep elders near home. Like tempered steel, the locals have been made sharper and stronger through extreme stress. Those who moved away often describe the feeling of a push-pull with their hometowns, acknowledging a gravity that keeps them in orbit around their roots. The relationship thrives at a distance, explaining why there are Pittsburgh Steeler bars from Vancouver to Miami to Belfast to Shanghai. They serve as embassies and surrogates for members of what demographer James Russell calls the Berg diaspora, and are the natural result of mass emigration, as well as a reminder of how globalization of an industry can lead to the global pollination of a culture. Sons and daughters lucky enough to feel attached to a distinct hometown know how it works its way under our skin and into our being. Pluck a hair out of my corpse 100 years from now, and the DNA evidence will show up that I grew up in Ambridge, one place on Earth, starting in 1955. Biologically, I am tied to it, but that's just the beginning. Nearly all of the following essays and stories are set in Ambridge and Pittsburgh, but every American settlement has seen its waves of immigrants. Those waves often come and go without us recognizing their singularity, their influence, and the pattern they follow. I have written these essays to acknowledge the 6 million boomers who moved away, from Milwaukee and Youngstown and Scranton and all the places in between, and an appreciation for the 6 million who stayed home and supplied the gravity, took care of the parents, the towns, and each other. So that's why I wrote it.
Thank you. Good.
That answers some questions.
So you want to hear about libraries or food?
Food.
Anybody know what a pierogi is?
Yes.
Yes.
You do?
Mm-hmm. like a potato ravioli.
Yeah.
Is it like?
Okay. Well, we'll get to them.
That's Polish.
That's Polish. It's Eastern European in general. They all have.
Really?
Yeah, they just call them different things.
Next one I'll have a hard one.
But if you, I think this one.
Did you bring us any?
Can I what?
Did
Pronounce?
you bring us any?
No, everybody asks that. You know, when I read this, the problem is they're not to feed you, and I do know how to make them, but
You know,
it takes a little time. Okay.
I have to share this with you. Ironically, yesterday I had a patron who immigrated here from Poland, and it was funny because we talked about pierogies.
Oh, you did?
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, they are
This is
Such a comfort.
a really favorite food. See, every Friday in Catholic school,
Yeah.
we didn't have a cafeteria that fed us lunch every day, but every Friday we raised money in the church by ladies making pierogies.
Oh, yeah.
So, but this is,
Were you always so positive in your attitude toward your hometown and leaving it and what was happening? Or did that come with maturity?
that came with, I think, yeah, distance
Maturity.
and maturity.
I was going to say aging, but maturity.
Yeah, yeah, that's good.
Both.
Yeah, both.
Because
Yeah.
it's very beautiful what you just read.
Thank you. Yeah,
Yeah.
I came to see it a different way, I think, when I
Yeah.
left, and it took a little time for that
If
to
you know
happen.
what was there, but you can't recreate it. It can't.
No,
The economy, that which was, cannot be recreated.
it has to be
It can be honored.
reinvented.
It can be honored,
Right.
Right.
It can be honored and reinvented,
right? But it won't be the
It's,
same.
but it never will be the same.
Right.
It's always going to be as it is. So I don't know if this happened in
We should
your.
get on national television and say that. Anyway. that's-
Well, in getting there, I did a big interview in New York last week, so
Oh, neat.
Good.
the word is getting out, I hope. So this is a little bit about Mimi Locarno was one of my girlfriends back at home, but I really liked just dating. So I'm going to just jump into this a little bit. The very idea of calling a girl, this comes from a chapter called Moms Who Put Out. Get your mind out of the gutter. The very idea of calling a girl and asking her to go to a dance or the zoo or a lake or to a football game or a concert felt like an adventure to me. After paying for my car insurance, I spent most of my money on dating. I had great pals, but seldom wasted a weekend night on them. Without looking for love or sex, my fascination with girls took over, and I happily did anything they wanted to do or not do. When I met a girl I liked, I wanted nothing more than to hold her hand. A nervous impulse, but a simple one. Hands told me what words could never tell, from the way they matched the rest of her body to the way she cared for them, and how they moved when she talked, how they gripped a cup or a fork or a stack of books. It went back to my fixation on my grandmother's hands, while they cooked and crocheted, and my father's way of working a pencil or plucking a pheasant. I kept track of my date's hands as I drove. Did they carve her words, fly all over, rest easily? Were they clasped between her knees or searching along the upholstery creases for comfort? Early on, I didn't date many girls who wanted much beyond kissing, who encouraged more touching. Those were girls who put out, a term I always found funny because even though the girls I dated didn't put out, their mothers did, in a way. Here, they would say the moment I walked in, let me put something out. When I heard that expression, it made me think of one mother who actually did put out in a carnal way for Mimi's brother Vinny. I knew the woman and dated both of her daughters, and she never put out so much as a single potato chip for me, but Vinny had no interest in potato chips, nor the daughters. Food played a starring role in our lives. All ethnicities had their specialties and everyday meals, and some I could identify the moment I crossed the threshold. Mimi's mother, for instance, was an insomniac, and she put out day and night. yanking a baked ziti out of the oven at 11:30 p.m. when Mimi and I were trying to sneak in from a date. The Polish Mrs. Locarno learned to cook Italian for the mister, forming a culinary marriage made in heaven. Sometimes she put out sausage and peppers or stuffed cabbage. She never left the kitchen, canning tomatoes or beans, sweating through August afternoons, or perched on a stool at night, smoking larks and listening to talk radio, ready with an apple or ricotta pie. Every Christmas Eve, Mrs. Locarno really put out. Anybody Italian here? She served a feast for at least 20 guests, then mounded the table with fried smelts and bacala, lupini beans, nuts, cheese, nougat candies, kumquats, oranges, cookies, apples, and hemmed it all in with carafes of homemade wine. We sang and ate and flirted, and Mrs. Locarno blushed with overwhelming joy and pride and exhaustion. When it came time for everyone to leave for midnight mass, I'm sure she leaned back and lit a post-climactic cigarette. Throughout high school, my pals and I often piled into one of our father's cars and visited girls we knew. We showed up without warning, but the moms usually threw their arms around us, regardless of their daughter's ennui. 3 of us might show up, sit around the kitchen table, and do our best to entertain the daughter, maybe one of her friends, but we saved our real charm for the moms, especially when we could smell brajol or stuffed artichokes left over from dinner. All these moms had leftovers. Even if their own families were small, they grew up learning to cook for big families. My own mother put out. By instinct, Betty pivoted after greeting a guest and flung open the fridge or the oven and soon presented God knows what. Pierogies, pork chops, chocolate cake. Dishes clattered as coats were removed, and before a guest could catch his breath, he was handed a fork. The urge to feed sprang from the bottom of her maternal heart. Then there were the fathers who put out. Try this, they insisted. Salty, manly, dried sausages in which you won't find no fat. Or a plate full of sauteed banana peppers they had grown themselves, smoked fish they had caught, venison they had bagged, wrapped in neat white paper, wine made in the basement, an endless parade of delicacies served with pride. Intense pride separated the dads from the moms. The men served trophies, masterpieces of fussy gardening or butchering, savory expressions of sweetness and heat and patience. If I asked for more, they loved me, but if I didn't, they didn't care. Their craft was for show as much as sharing. Although the moms were proud too, the cooking was second nature to them, and they derived most of their satisfaction from the way we dove in, the passion with which we lapped up sauces and picked up every last crumb. Then they insisted on more, sometimes refilling a plate without asking. But Mrs. Silverman, I already ate half the brisket. She had another one in the oven. The grandmothers were worse. Before I could take Angela Andolini out for a Sunday afternoon drive, she stipulated that we go to see her Nonna, always just for a few minutes. Greens, collard greens, broccoli rabe, chard, whatever Vic Amoroso had fresh at his market, she steeped in broth and salt pork with moony white beans. The minute I walked in, she put it out. Bowls big enough to feed a St. Bernard. After 3 helpings, I pleaded with Angela to say goodbye. Then the old woman would frown and shove us both out the door, yelling, "No wonder you're so skinny." My mom pulled the same stunt, never satisfied with my satisfaction. I could eat 6 or 8 meatballs, but then she held the bowl in front of me again, urging me to what? Go for an even dozen? I'd groan and wave her off. She'd shrug and say, "You don't much care for my meatballs, do you?" I heard a hint of jealousy and suspicion in her voice. She was thinking, what does Dorothy Sacco put in those meatballs he likes so much? But she was a good sport, even after she found out that Mrs. Colorito always, without fail, made me a cake for my birthday because I once told her she made the best cake I had ever tasted. I wasn't lying. It remains the best. The woman had 5 kids of her own. but she couldn't help herself. Standing back away from the table, her hands folded in front of her apron, she watched me eat and hoped her daughter was taking note. That's that.
That brings back memories.
Yeah.
Does that bring back
Oh my
memories?
God,
Yeah,
yeah.
You know that statement? Let me put
Oh.
something out.
Yeah.
All my sisters are married to Italians.
There you
There
go.
were 6 girls, so they all married Italian
And they all
fellas.
married Italians?
Oh,
And you married
an Irishman.
an Irishman. Yeah, right.
All of them are.
Boy, when those Irish-Italian weddings happened, though, I always wanted to be invited because they were big and they were fun.
But cooking was such a big deal.
Big
yeah.
part for the Italian families.
Yeah,
Yeah, and the men too, right?
Yeah.
They did
Oh,
things
yeah.
themselves.
yeah.
Yeah, that was. I think it was
And
a
when
really
you said the baklava and all that stuff,
Yeah.
and the
bacala.
baklava,
Yeah, right.
and the smelts, and I remember so much of all that.
Yeah, that's the way it was.
My roommate,
So much food.
my roommate in college, his mom was Sicilian and her dad was Polish. And this is up in Cleveland.
Okay.
That's where I went to.
Mhm.
And my birthday's in October, and we start at school. I went to college. I grew up in I told you, an hour south of Toledo in a
Yeah.
small farming community. And so Cleveland's a big city. I went to college in a suburb of Cleveland, and her mom. They had a surprise me. We lived on the first floor of our dorm, and my roommate had arranged for everyone to have a surprise party for me because I was kind of homesick by October.
Mhm.
And her mom, I'll never forget. Her brothers came and her sister, and they carried in like cartons. And her mom had made. I'd never seen pizza made that way, like on the sheet, and that's how
The
she
big
brought
sheet
it
pan.
in.
Mm-hmm.
And it was the big, thick, all
Yeah.
homemade, and the best pizza I've ever had. And the cake was the white with the strawberries and
You
just
never
like you just
forgot
said, it was just
Traditions.
It
and
just kept on
just
coming.
kept-
yeah, the food. It was just like we were in the lounge of the dorm, and of course other people are like that lived on the other floors. What's going on, And it's Sue's birthday, and everybody. It was just, and I was just like, I'd never seen anything like this in my life,
Excuse me.
and it was.
Yeah.
And then I went to her house. When I went to her house the first time, it was like the same thing.
Really
You have
overwhelming.
to have the lasagna. And,
Right.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
I can.
Yeah.
What you're talking about, I can really.
You get it.
I know.
Yeah, I remember the first time I flew overseas with my wife. We came to New York and we were waiting at LaGuardia. At that time, your family could come with you to
Right.
the gate.
Yeah.
And so we were going to Rome, and the plane was broken, so they had to bring a new plane in. So it was going to be hours, and the people from New York they ran home. They came back with pots of sauce, enough to feed everyone in the gate who was waiting for
Oh
the
my
plane,
gosh.
and big Coke bottles full of wine.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It was fantastic.
Wow.
Yeah, that's a great culture, and
Yeah.
it was really fun to grow up in that.
Yeah.
Wow.
So let me see. I think I'm going to read to you a story about my uncle. And this involves Massachusetts a little bit too. So, one Sunday before, it's called A Flame That Water Fed. One Sunday before Mass, I followed my Uncle Charlie into the crowded vestibule. As I waited to dip my fingers into the holy water, I noticed him cup his hands and splash the water onto his forehead. So that's how he does it, I thought. That's how he makes it look like he's crying. It was a deliberate show of devotion, a bit of theater to accompany his loud singing and praying. His parents had carried the infant Charles Blaise Cassidy across the Atlantic from Tralee on Ireland's west coast to Pittsburgh, where he stayed. He never spoke about his family in Ireland. He related what his parents had told him about the crossing, and remembered only the diesel fumes and the smell of the sea. But I often saw him standing at the kitchen sink, absent-mindedly catching and caressing the stream running from the faucet. Nephews and nieces sat entranced by stories he told of fighting fires in the city. I remember Uncle Charlie bowing and shaking his head as he recalled families who sat weeping on curbs, tears soaking their nightclothes as the flames reflected in their eyes. The hoses, he said, nearly pulled his arms from their sockets. With reverence and fear, the fireman with the middle name of Blaze praised the water for saving the city and cursed it for the icy nights and the flooded basements in which family treasures were drowned. Pittsburgh's steel mills working round the clocks kept taverns open all night. When Charlie's mates headed off to douse their own fires with Boilermakers, he took the trolley straight home. And through all the family weddings and wakes, we never saw him drink a drop. Yet he drank himself to death. When his eldest son married and moved to New England, he invited Charlie to his house near the beach. At first, Charlie refused to visit, saying he had no interest in the beach. But when his first granddaughter was born, Charlie relented and traveled to Massachusetts, where he would once again encounter the sea. Charlie was struck to his knees before the blue eyes of his granddaughter and the waves as they crashed against the seawall and retreated into the depths. Throwing his freckled arms toward the Atlantic, he couldn't bear to leave, as if the tide had seized him. He returned several times a year and always had to tear himself away, each time more painful than the last. At home, he lined windowsills and bookcases with shells and ordinary-looking rocks from the coast. He waxed about the mist and kelp, and even though he rarely swam and never set foot in a boat, if you got him started talking about the ocean, he blathered like an old salt on a bar stool. My cousin and his wife had 3 more children, and Charlie visited more often. As much as the children, the sea itself drew him. Finally, he couldn't leave it behind. Take into account his cockeyed religious fervor, which leaned farther over the gunwales of his sanity as the years went on, convincing him that God had laid the Atlantic Ocean at his feet as a gesture of abundance. Charlie vowed to make it his own, to become one with it, to honor the Lord through gratitude. He asked a buddy to steal 2 5-gallon carboys from the water coolers at City Hall. And so the next time he and my Aunt Dolores drove up to Massachusetts, Charlie loaded the empty bottles into the trunk of his car. He waited until the last hours of their visit, then parked at the beach, waddled into the bay, and allowed the surf to fill his bottles. He corked them, lugged them to the car, and turned his back on the ocean without regret this time, without so much as a glance in the rearview mirror. Once home, he stashed the bottles in a closet near the front door. I had seen them one afternoon as I hung my coat, but I couldn't guess why they were there. Every morning for 2 years, as the sun broke through the clotheslines in the backyard, while he waited for the kettle to whistle, he padded over to the closet with a juice glass in his hand and decanted a few ounces of brine. He bragged about his regimen one Sunday evening during my family's regular visit. We had grown accustomed to Uncle Charlie retiring early on Sundays. When he was younger, he excused himself and went to bed. But as he grew older and more peculiar, he made a show of unfolding an old army cot in the living room and stretching out with the children as Disney's Tinkerbell appeared on the TV screen. Dressed in his pajamas, he stood before us and announced, "I have found the essence of life, of us all, of eternal health." He raised a glass of brackish water from the Massachusetts Bay, that very bay surrounding Boston Harbor, its effluent ripened in a dark closet on Pittsburgh's north side. He praised God, his children, the earth and its waters, and tossed it back. "Down the hatch," he croaked, wiping his lips with the back of his hand. We were aghast. Even I, an adventurous teenager and susceptible to any dare, could not imagine a wager high enough or a girl pretty enough to make me swallow the salty goo and tufts of algae I saw slide from the glass. Then Charles Blaze Cassidy lay down to sleep, all his blessings gathered around him and his faith taking him from within. His wake was wet with reverence. but all I could think about were the legions of microbes, apparent in the green slime floating in his juice glass, attacking his organs. How water had delivered him to the new world, brought salvation to the victims he saved, called him home, and carried him away.
Nice job.
So, is there anything else you would do? Anything you'd like to do? Can you relate to this kind of
Yes.
religious
Yes,
fervor?
yes.
Yes.
Do you have
Yeah.
another special chapter that you?
Well, you know, they're all special to me. Some are longer than others. I can tell you about history. I can tell you about my parents. I can tell you about working in a steel mill.
What would you like to?
You've had an interesting background because weren't you a chef?
I was a cook. I always say that I was a cook and
Okay.
not a chef because I wasn't in charge of the kitchen
Okay,
ever. And that chief and chef.
but you've written cookbooks?
I've written for the restaurant industry. I've written recipes
Okay.
for magazines. That's how I supported myself going into college and through college as a bartender and a waiter and a cook. My
Where-
mother taught me to cook.
Where were you when you were a cook? What?
I was in Pittsburgh and I did a little bit in Boston, and then a few years ago I was writing all about the restaurant business and about the world of chefs and cooking, and I noticed that people were getting a little bit too attached to food, that it seemed fetishistic to me. I wrote about this in one essay, basically saying that again, my generation, growing up, it was all about sex. We had the sexual revolution. And so the music was about sex, the clothes were about sex. And when we kind of reached middle age, we sort of turned it to food. And now it's all about food. People, you go to people's houses, they talk about restaurants. You know, they taught people, there's all kind of magazines you can read, all kind of websites about food. So we've kind of done the same thing with food. So fed up with that, I decided I'd stop writing about it and go see if I could do it again. So here's an admission. When I was a cook and a bartender and the shift was over, anybody ever work in restaurants? Yeah. All I wanted to do was drink and get high. That's what I wanted to do. Something about the adrenaline, the way it fell off of you at the end of a shift, similar to theater. And so I thought, okay, now I'm in my 40s, and I put my magazine editors aside, and I said, I'm going back to cooking, and I got a job working in a sort of a place that did takeout food, a fancy place, and another place, an artist colony. And after my first dinner shift, feeding 3 people a few courses, I got back in my car, and I immediately wanted to get drunk and get high. Of course, I was more mature at that time and did not do either of those. I went straight home to my wife. But it brought that same feeling back, and I think it was about adrenaline, about being up for the show. And I did learn that I could do it again. That was kind of nice. So I did it for 2 years and then went back. The editors were asking me to keep writing, so I couldn't keep up the pace of a cook. I don't know. But I also found that it was a good way to lose weight because I actually lost weight. The more I worked, the more I cooked. I only ate little bits of food at a time. I usually was satisfied. Didn't feel like sitting down to eat.
Did you ever hear of that movie Burnt with Bradley Cooper?
I haven't seen that movie. I've heard of it. Is it
Gotta see
good?
Oh my God.
Is it about the
It's
crazy
just about
lifestyle?
cooking. Yep, that's all it is all about the chef.
It was
And they
one
were
of the
all
first
They
stories.
were all crazy.
It's pretty crazy. Yeah.
It was in
exactly.
Paris.
Oh my,
And
even
it was,
worse.
it was, what is that restaurant? The Langham?
Mhm.
Langdon? You know, the
Oh.
Boston one?
Yeah.
Well, it was in Paris, the Langdon.
Oh, I see. Okay.
And it was all about competing for the 3-star, I think.
Yeah.
3-star.
Yeah.
Oh my gosh. Yeah, you gotta see it. It's
That's
very-
pretty tough.
Yeah.
So, let's see if I have something here that
What about
Good.
parents? Was there?
Yeah, a little bit about my grandparents. Please excuse my going through this, because I'm trying to take some pieces out of it.
Yeah, they
Okay.
came specifically to work in the mills?
Yeah,
or
almost specifically.
ancillary, yeah.
Yeah,
From
the mills.
Slovenia. From
Yes,
Slovenia.
and so a little bit of history. This place on this plateau on the Ohio River was seen by George Washington in 1753, and he met an Indian chief there. And the Indian chief's name was Chief Tanagreesa. And the French were trying to win his favor, and the English were trying to win his favor, and different flags were going up and down their flagpole all the time. And finally, Washington managed to convince him to fight with him. And they were fighting the French south of Pittsburgh at one point. And Washington was not a very good military man at that time. He was beaten and routed a couple of times. But at one point, they captured a French diplomat who had actually come there to negotiate with the English. After a battle, they captured him. And this Indian chief allegedly had his family, his father was boiled and dismembered by the French, and he remembered that. And having this guy kneeling before him, and Washington with him, he drove an axe through his head and killed him. Washington, in a badly translated document, admitted to this assassination. And when it got back to the King of England, or the King of France, it triggered the First World War the world's ever known. Our part was the French and Indian War, but that was fought all over the world between English colonies and French colonies. And so it was that act, the person he met in my hometown, or what became my hometown. After that, he sent, after the war, he sent a bunch of soldiers there to train to fight the Indians, because he remembered the spot. It was great, could see the river from both sides. And growing up, I never heard about any of this. And in that contingent of men who were training there was William Henry Harrison, who would become president. William Eaton, who started the Marines. Meriwether Lewis met Clark there. These were Zebulon Pike trained there of Pikes Peak. But growing up, we heard nothing about it, because it was not my grandparents' history. So, in 1824, then, a prophet came. He had come from Germany. He was in jail. He had 18,000 followers. Not all came with him. Came to Philadelphia. Then they went north of Pittsburgh, built a settlement there, and a thriving settlement. They were very industrious, and they sold it to the Mennonites. Then they moved to Indiana and built a bigger settlement. In 10 years, they built something like 400 stone buildings. And they were making whiskey, and they were making wine, and they were making silk, or they were making textiles, and they were doing everything and supplying people to go into the West. Well, it was too far west. They moved back toward Pittsburgh and found the same place and set up their settlement there. And they were celibates. And they were waiting for Christ to appear within 100 years. They worked like crazy. And they became the richest intentional community in America. They had the founder under his bed in 1838, when a panic struck, had more money in gold and silver coins in a vault under his bed than the U.S. Treasury had at the time. They owned all the land around the discovery of oil in the late 1870s. And within 2 years of the discovery of oil, they were shipping 750,000 barrels of oil to Rockefeller in Cleveland on train tracks that they owned and barrels that they built. They were enormously wealthy. So in 1904, I said there were visionaries. J.P. Morgan came, and he took the Berlin Steel Works, he took the great structural steel companies that were scattered around America, created U.S. Steel and the American Bridge Division. that would eventually build the Empire State Building, the Verrazano Narrows Bridge, the Hancock Tower in Chicago and in Boston, and bridges that you'll even find all over New England. There's one in Kittery. The American Bridge Company called the town Ambridge, and that's how it got its name.
Oh, that's interesting.
So
I like
that's
that.
that's when I speak of Ambridge. And there's a story in the book that I won't give you now, but the story in the book where when I was, well, maybe I will. I'll give you a little snippet. That after I came to Boston, I got a job in an alternative newspaper in Cambridge called The Real Paper. The Real Paper.
Yeah.
It was like the Phoenix. Remember?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
And after that, so here's a story of after I got my first paycheck. 2 weeks after I reported for work, a Friday night in September of 1978, after making sure the paper had gone to the printer, I crossed the street to the Plow and Stars for beer and hippie lasagna. The place is still there. The editors, artists, and ad sellers soon splintered off, leaving me alone with the cash from my first paycheck pulling me into Harvard Square. Students returning from summer break filled the square, chattering four abreast, oblivious to traffic and crosswalks. I had never seen such wild disregard for traffic or safety. Drivers jabbed their brakes and horns as they crept through clusters of bewildered freshmen and excited sophomores leaning in to hear each other's stories. Professors gazed at the pavement, murmuring a lecture or allowing madness to move their lips. They all strode at a brisk clip, sidestepping browsers at newsstands and head bobbers squatting in alcoves and doorways where folk singers played for pocket change. At the corner of Mass Ave, they all said Ave, never Avenue, and Boylston, I stopped and got my bearings. My nose followed the perfume of girls in boots and miniskirts, their Carole Kingish hair riding the breeze off the Charles River. The men were dressed in wrinkled linen and faded jeans. Some wore berets and pored over chessboards on street-side tables, their chins resting on their fists. I had explored Harvard Square a few times that month, but as the students returned, I realized I'd seen their ilk only in Life magazine stories about American youth traveling abroad or ski bunnies of the eastern slopes. The 60s and early 70s had brought counterculture to this scene. Harvard students were portrayed on television and in film as precocious law students, apologists for Timothy Leary, sitters in, and protesters. In their midst, I was drawn to their sense of purpose, their enunciation, their understated layers of cotton and tweed, and their talk of horses and squash. One day they would be pulling the strings and working the levers that determined world events. I had embarked on a new adventure, now 8 weeks in Boston, and my job in the circulation department of the paper gave me a sense of permanence. I would move out of my cousin's house, rent an apartment, and find my footing among these people who had an entirely different bearing than I did. When I looked down, I saw the wrongness in my shoes. They were two-tone, black and gray, something Sonny Corleone might wear. I fingered my gauzy shirt and thought I might be trying too hard. But these were the 1970s, and who cared about clothes? I was the age of a graduate student, had big hair, and moved easily among strangers. Big hair. Near the center of the square, I heard the blues rising out of a doorway to a basement music club named Jonathan Swift's. I sprung for the cover charge and descended into the squeal of slide guitar. After buying a beer, I found a place to stand behind a few rows of seats, closed my eyes, and drifted along the swells of a saxophone solo. I separated the odors and then let them blend again. Beery floorboards, summer bodies, hot amplifiers, cigarettes, marijuana breath, and herbal essence shampoo. The long hair of the girl standing next to me kept tickling my forearm, and I didn't want to interrupt it. So I held my eyes closed and fell into the music. Applause called me back to the room, and I looked down to see the woman beside me clapping, tossing her hair to the side until she reached over her head with her other hand and pulled it behind her ear. Nice beaded earring, I thought. She smiled at me, then looked back to the stage, sipping from a plastic cup. I just love John Mayall, she said, turning her green eyes toward me. She surprised me. I hadn't expected her to speak, and I knew nothing about Mayall. Why, is all I could squeeze out. She said something like, his blues find me. I don't remember what I said, only that she asked, are you from around here? A question I took to mean that I didn't appear to be a student. No. You? She was from Evanston, Illinois, which, geography freak that I was, I knew was outside Chicago. For some reason, though, I hadn't expected her to ask the same question, and a precise answer might crack my new persona that I had been fashioning for myself. And you? She asked. Oh, a little town outside Pittsburgh. Which one? What's its name? It doesn't matter. Yes, it does, she shot back, a little perturbed. Ambridge. She asked me to spell it, so I did. Oh, like Cambridge, without the C. I was struck by the similarity, which began and ended with that initial letter C. Cambridge, originally Newtown, renamed to match its aspirations, its eventual power and privilege, erudition and stateliness, all its history and money, presidents, preachers, and philosophers, its rowers pulling sculls down the Charles, sweating for sport. Ambridge, originally economy, named for its landlord, the American Bridge Company, its steel, smoke, and football, corruption and soot, its displaced immigrants and fractured languages, thugs, brawlers, bookies, and mobsters, barge loads of ore and coal grunting up the Ohio, where nothing but carp and catfish could survive. Cambridge, a tangle of streets lined with bookstores and libraries, galleries and museums, coffee houses, theaters, dormitories, and think tanks. Ambridge, a simple grid of company houses and bars, churches, pizza joints, machine shops, Sons of Italy, Polish Falcons, factories, vegetable patches, alleyways, all-night diners, shrines to the Virgin, more bars. The Mayall fans comparison triggered this psychic excursion, and when I snapped out of it, I looked all over the dark basement and tried to catch a whiff of her, but she was gone. She was interested enough to ask about me, to demand an answer. How could I let her slip away like that? Where had I gone? I was trying to immerse myself in this new place, to forget about Ambridge, and one simple mention sent me off into space. She probably thought I was stoned. I had entered my imagined land of milk and honey. Like my grandparents, in the moment I put my old home behind me, hate when that happens. I put my old home behind me and looked ahead. In the decades that followed, mill towns dying along rivers became a cliche melded together as the Rust Belt. In the years to follow, I tried to shake the effects of growing up there, the hillbilly twinges in my diction, the mill workers' class anxiety, a cynical edge to my natural optimism. I wanted to shed all that, but I also felt a son's attachment.
Great.
Thanks for having me.
Oh,
Thanks for staying.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
He brought
Yeah.
some copies of his book.
If you want to buy the books, fine. If you want to take the books from the library, I encourage you to do that too. I love libraries. There's a story in the book about my love for libraries.
Okay, wait,
Awesome.
And, okay,
go.
okay. You can buy Rust Belt book on Amazon, but I prefer you buy it from Bowen Publishing. And Bowen Publishing has a website that's BAUHAN publishing.com. And you can also visit my website, which will give you lots of information about this book and about me. It's www.paulhertneky, altogether.com. Thank you.
Okay.
Thanks, Charlie.